We've all had those exhausting commutes where your eyes just won't stay open. But when you wake up drooling on the cashmere coat of a stranger, you usually just apologize and walk away. You don't expect that stranger to be Chicago's most ruthless crime syndicate boss, and you certainly don't expect him to hunt you down. The digital clock on the wall of Northwestern Memorial's emergency room glared a relentless 2:14 a.m. Abigail Faith pushed through the swinging double doors, her legs feeling like they were filled with wet cement. Being a trauma nurse was a calling, but it was also a physical punishment. At 240 pounds, Abigail felt every single one of those 14 hours in her swollen ankles and the deep, throbbing ache in her lower back. Stepping out into the biting December wind of Chicago, she pulled her heavy wool coat tighter around her. She always felt hyper-visible and entirely invisible at the same time. People saw her size, first they always did, but rarely looked past it to see her. Tonight she didn't care. She just wanted her bed. The Red Line station was desolate, smelling faintly of stale beer and ozone. When the train finally clattered into the station, Abigail boarded a nearly empty car. There were only two other people, a teenager asleep with headphones blasting and a man sitting near the middle doors. Abigail collapsed into a seat, 2 rows down from the man letting out a breath she felt she'd been holding since noon. She tried to keep her posture rigid, a defense mechanism she'd developed years ago to take up as little space as possible. But the rhythmic rocking motion of the train was hypnotic. The heater beneath the seat blasted warm air against her frozen calves. Her eyelids drooped. She fought it, snapping her head up, but her exhaustion was absolute. Slowly, gravity won. Her head tilted to the side, and the darkness took over. When Abigail woke up, she was warm. Too warm. And she was resting on something incredibly firm, yet soft on the surface. She blinked, her vision blurring, before snapping into focus on a lapel of dark, immaculately tailored cashmere. Panic spiked in her chest. She hadn't just fallen asleep. She had slid down the slick plastic bench and was practically burrowed into the side of the man who had been sitting 2 rows away. He must have moved. Or she had. Mortification flooded her. Society had ingrained a deep fear in Abigail about her body, that it was burdensome, that it was in the way. She gasped and scrambled backward, her heavy winter boots slipping clumsily on the floor. "Oh my God, I am so sorry," she stammered, her face burning hot. I was so tired. I didn't mean to lean on you. I'm so sorry." She expected a look of disgust. She expected him to brush off his sleeve as if she had contaminated him. Instead, the man slowly turned his head. He was breathtaking, but in a harsh, terrifying way. He had sharp, aristocratic features, a strong jaw shadowed by a day's worth of stubble, and eyes the color of a winter lake, cold, deep, and piercingly blue. A faint, silvery scar cut through his left eyebrow. He didn't look annoyed. He looked entirely calm, studying her with an intensity that made her breath hitch. "You were exhausted," he said. His voice was a low, gravelly baritone that vibrated over the ambient noise of the train. He didn't brush his coat. "It's fine. I took up half your space." Abigail rambled, unable to stop her nervous habit of over-apologizing. "I know I'm heavy. Did I hurt your shoulder?" For a fraction of a second, the corner of his mouth twitched upward. "I've carried heavier burdens, sweetheart. You felt like a feather." It was a smooth line, but it didn't sound rehearsed. It sounded like a statement of fact. Then his eyes dropped to her chest. Not in a leering way, but reading the laminated Northwestern Memorial YD badge clipped to her coat. "Long shift, Abigail." Hearing her name in that dark, rich voice sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the Chicago cold. "Belmont," the automated voice overhead announced. "That's me," Abigail blurted out, standing up so fast she felt dizzy. "Sorry again." She bolted for the doors, practically throwing herself onto the platform as they slid open. She didn't look back until the train started moving. When she finally turned, he was still sitting there, watching her through the grime-streaked glass. His gaze didn't leave hers until the train plunged into the darkness of the tunnel. Abigail walked the 3 blocks to her apartment, her heart hammering against her ribs. She couldn't shake the smell of him, expensive cedar wood bergamot, and underneath it, the faint metallic tang of copper. It wasn't until she was safely locked in her bathroom, washing her face, that she realized what that copper smell was. Blood. 48 hours later, the memory of the stranger on the train had faded into a bizarre, sleep-deprived hallucination. Friday night in the ER was a war zone. The triage board was completely red. Abigail was in Trauma Bay, 3 charting the vitals of a drunk driver, when the hospital doors slammed open. Dr. Harrison, the senior attending, shouted for a crash cart. "Gunshot wound to the abdomen. No exit wound. BP is tanking," a paramedic yelled, rushing a gurney covered in blood-soaked gauze into Trauma Bay 1. Abigail dropped her chart and ran to assist. She pushed through the curtain. There were 2 other men in the room, not paramedics, but massive men in dark suits, their faces grim and eyes darting around the room like trapped wolves. They didn't belong here. "Get them out," Dr. Harrison barked, but the men didn't budge. "We stay with Leo," the larger of the 2 growled, crossing his arms over his broad chest. Abigail stepped up to the gurney with a pair of trauma shears ready to cut away the patient's ruined shirt. Her hands froze. Lying there pale and bleeding profusely from his right flank was the man from the Red Line. The cashmere coat was gone, replaced by a ruined dress shirt, but the sharp jaw, the scar through the eyebrow, and those piercing blue eyes were unmistakable. His eyes fluttered open. Despite the agony, he must have been in his gaze locked onto Abigail. The chaotic noise of the ER seemed to dial down to a hum. "The nurse, from the train," he rasped, coughing weakly. "You know him, Faith, doctor?" Harrison asked, confused, as he packed the wound to stop the arterial bleed. No, just a passing encounter," Abigail said, shaking off her shock and forcing her professional training to kick in. She started an IV line, her fingers deft and quick despite trembling. "Enzo," the man Leo wheezed to the large man in the suit. "Clear the hallway. Nobody comes in but the doctors." For 20 minutes it was touch and go. They stabilized him enough for emergency surgery, but Dr. Harrison needed a specific type of blood from the bank immediately. "Faith, go get the O negative. Now." Abigail sprinted out of the bay. The hallway was strangely quiet, guarded by Leo's men. She rounded the corner toward the blood bank and nearly collided with an orderly pushing a mop bucket. "Watch it," he muttered, keeping his head down. Something nagged at Abigail's brain. The orderly was wearing standard blue scrubs, but his shoes were heavy black combat boots, not the standard fluid-resistant clogs or running shoes every hospital staffer wore. And his ID badge was flipped backward. She grabbed the blood bags and hurried back, her heart pounding. As she approached Trauma Bay 1, she saw the orderly again. He wasn't mopping. He was standing near the entrance of the bay. Enzo and the other guard were momentarily distracted by a pair of police officers who had just arrived at the front desk. The orderly reached into the mop bucket. When his hand came out, it wasn't holding a sponge. It was holding a matte black handgun with a long cylindrical suppressor attached to the barrel. He took a step toward the curtain of Trauma Bay 1. Abigail didn't think. If she shouted, he would pull the trigger. If she ran for help, Leo would die. To her left was a heavy, stainless steel linen and medical supply cart. It easily weighed 200 pounds, fully loaded. Adrenaline, pure and blinding, flooded her system. Abigail threw her entire body weight against the cart. For years she had been self-conscious of her mass, but right now physics was on her side. Mass times acceleration equals force. With a guttural yell, she shoved the cart forward like a linebacker. The heavy steel wheels caught the linoleum floor and became a missile. The assassin barely had time to turn his head before the steel cart slammed into his ribcage with a sickening crunch. The impact lifted him off his feet, pinning him violently against the drywall of the corridor. The gun flew from his hand, clattering across the floor. Before the man could recover, Enzo and the second guard were on him. It was a blur of brutal, efficient violence. The assassin was on the ground unconscious, his jaw broken. Abigail stood there gasping for air, clutching the bags of O-negative blood to her chest. Her knees shook so violently, she had to lean against the wall. The curtain to Trauma Bay 1 was pulled back. Leo Castiglione was sitting up slightly on the gurney, his face ashen, ignoring Dr. Harrison's frantic pleas to lie down. He looked at the unconscious assassin, then at the dented steel cart, and finally his eyes landed on Abigail. He didn't look surprised. He looked fascinated. Faith. Dr. Harrison yelled, oblivious to the Mafia war that had just spilled into his ER. The blood. Abigail handed it over her hands, shaking. Once Leo was prepped for surgery, she stepped out to scrub her hands, feeling like she might vomit. She washed her hands until they were raw, the cold water failing to calm her racing pulse. When she stepped out of the bathroom, Enzo was waiting for her. The giant man looked at her with a newfound respect. "Boss wants a word before he goes under," Enzo said, his voice surprisingly soft. Abigail followed him back to the bay. The anesthesia team was prepping the IV push. Leo looked terrible, but his eyes were sharp. He reached out his bloody, scarred knuckles, brushing against her wrist. His grip was weak, but absolute. "What's your full name?" he whispered. "Abigail. Abigail Faith." She replied, her voice trembling. "You shouldn't have done that, Abigail Faith," he said, his breath hitching as a wave of pain washed over him. "Now they know your face. You interrupted a hit ordered by the Moretti family." I just reacted," she stammered. "I wasn't going to let him shoot a patient in my ER." Leo's lips curved into a faint, grim smile. The anesthesia was kicking in. His eyelids were heavy. "Pack a bag," he slurred slightly. "Enzo is taking you to the safe house." "What? No." Abigail backed away. "I have a job. I have a life. I'm not going anywhere with you people." Leo's eyes locked onto hers with a possessive, terrifying clarity that cut right through the sedatives. "You saved my life, Abigail," he whispered right before his eyes slid shut. "In my world, that means I own your debts, and it means you belong to me until I say you're safe." The heart monitor beeped steadily. He was under. Abigail looked at Enzo, terrified. "I'm not going." Enzo stepped between her and the door. "Miss Faith, with all due respect to what you just did, it wasn't a request." The ride to the safe house was a suffocating blur of tinted glass and aggressive silence. Enzo drove a heavily armored black Suburban through the desolate Chicago streets, taking a convoluted route that eventually fed onto Interstate 94 North, heading toward the Wisconsin border. Abigail sat in the back seat, her fists clenched in her lap. She wasn't crying. The adrenaline that had allowed her to weaponize a 200-pound medical cart was fading, replaced by a cold, dense anger. She was a professional. She paid her taxes, worked brutal shifts, and minded her own business. Now her phone was resting at the bottom of the Chicago River, tossed out the window by Enzo, 20 minutes into the drive, and she was being abducted by the very man she had helped save. "This is kidnapping," Abigail said, her voice flat, devoid of the panic she knew Enzo expected. Enzo didn't look in the rearview mirror. "It's relocation, Miss Faith. The Morettis have cops on their payroll. They have orderlies, as you saw. If you go back to your apartment, you won't make it to Monday morning. You're a loose end." "I don't know anything." "You know Leo Castiglione was vulnerable, and you stopped his assassination. In our world, that makes you a partisan." They arrived at an isolated compound 2 hours later, hidden deep within the heavily wooded shores of Lake Geneva. It wasn't a stereotypical Mafia mansion with gaudy statues and marble columns. It was a brutalist structure of poured concrete steel and floor-to-ceiling reinforced glass, designed less for luxury and more to withstand a siege. Cameras tracked their approach. Heavily armed men in tactical gear patrolled the perimeter. For the next 4 days, Abigail was a prisoner in a gilded cage. She was given a guest suite that was larger than her entire apartment, stocked with clothes that had been hurriedly purchased in her exact size, a detail that both impressed and deeply unsettled her. They hadn't guessed her size. They had accessed her medical or purchasing records with terrifying speed. On the 5th day, Leo arrived. He was transported in a private, unmarked ambulance. Against the advice of whatever underground surgeon had finished the work, Dr. Harrison started. Leo refused to stay in a clandestine clinic. He wanted to be in his own fortress. The compound had a fully equipped medical bay in the basement. When the private nurses Leo's organization hired proved to be intimidated and trembling in his presence, Abigail stepped in. She didn't do it out of affection. She did it because incompetence in a trauma recovery setting drove her insane. She pushed past a terrified private nurse who was failing to properly change Leo's bandages. "Move!" Abigail ordered, snapping on a pair of latex gloves. Leo was lying on the sterile bed, pale, sweating, and glaring at the ceiling. The heavy painkillers were clearly not doing enough, or he was refusing to take the proper dosage. When he heard Abigail's voice, he slowly turned his head. The silver scar through his eyebrow twitched. "The reluctant savior," he rasped. "Shut up and hold still," Abigail said, her tone identical to the one she used on combative drunks in the ER. She peeled back the heavy adhesive of the surgical dressing. The incision was clean, but the surrounding tissue was deeply bruised and angry. She cleaned the site with betadine, her hand steady, applying the exact amount of pressure needed, firm enough to clean, gentle enough not to tear the fresh sutures. Leo watched her face intently. He didn't flinch. "You have heavy hands, Abigail. Grounded. Most people touch me like they're afraid I'm going to bite." "You are going to bite," Abigail muttered, taping down a fresh gauze pad. "You kidnapped me. I kept you breathing." Leo shifted, wincing as the muscles in his abdomen protested. He gestured to Enzo, who was standing in the corner. Enzo handed Leo a thick manila folder. Leo tossed it onto the metal tray table next to Abigail. "Open it." Abigail hesitated, then peeled off her gloves and flipped the folder open. Inside were photographs, surveillance shots of her apartment building in Rogers Park. The front door of her unit had been kicked in. The interior was completely destroyed, furniture slashed, drywall torn open. In one of the photos, a man lay dead on her living room floor. It was the same hitman she had pinned against the wall in the hospital, his neck broken. The Morettis sent him back to finish the job on you the moment he posted bail. Leo explained, his voice cold and clinical. "My men intercepted him. If Enzo hadn't pulled you out of the hospital, you would have been sitting on that couch when he kicked the door in." Abigail felt the blood drain from her face. Her heavy body suddenly felt entirely weightless, disconnected from the floor. She gripped the edge of the metal tray table to steady herself, her knuckles turning white. "Why is this happening?" she whispered. "Because of Arthur Pendleton," Leo said. "He's a federal prosecutor for the Northern District. A real private name with real public power. Pendleton has been building a RICO case against my family for 2 years. But he's dirty. He's taking Moretti money to wipe us out legally, while the Morettis wipe us out physically. I have the ledger proving Pendleton's corruption. I was on my way to hand it over to a contact at the Department of Justice when they hit me on the red line." Abigail looked down at him. "You were sitting on a public train with evidence to take down a federal prosecutor. Nobody looks for the boss of the Castiglione family on the red line at 2 in the morning. Leo said, a dark amusement flickering in his eyes. "Except you. You just needed a pillow." He reached out his large, calloused hand, wrapping around her wrist. His thumb brushed over her pulse point. It was a deeply intimate gesture, devoid of the predatory creepiness she usually expected from powerful men. "You don't hide, Abigail," he said quietly. "You take up space. You stand your ground. I need that right now. Because Pendleton knows I'm alive, and the Morettis know where I am." The attack came on the 8th night, signaled not by an alarm, but by absolute darkness. A massive thunderstorm was rolling off Lake Michigan, hammering the concrete walls of the compound. At 2 a.m., the lights snapped off. Abigail, sleeping in the guest suite above the medical bay, waited for the hum of the backup generators. The silence stretched on. 10 seconds. 30 seconds. The generators had been disabled. Gunfire erupted downstairs. It wasn't the loud, cinematic banging of action movies. It was the sharp, mechanical crack, crack, crack of suppressed tactical rifles. Abigail threw off the heavy duvet. She didn't bother looking for shoes. She moved through the darkness with a quiet speed that surprised people who only judged her by her size. She knew how to distribute her weight, how to move without heavy footfalls. She opened her door and slipped into the hallway. The smell of pulverized drywall and burning sulfur was already wafting up the stairwell. Below her, men were shouting in Italian and English. "Fall back to the basement, secure the package." Enzo's voice roared over the din. Abigail didn't run toward the front door. She ran toward the medical bay. If Leo died, she had no leverage, no protection, and no way out of this nightmare. She scrambled down the emergency stairwell, her bare feet slapping against the cold concrete. When she reached the basement level, the steel door to the medical suite was open. Enzo was dragging a heavily bleeding guard inside, firing his sidearm blindly down the corridor. Abigail grabbed the heavy steel handle of the door and heaved it shut the moment Enzo and the guard cleared the threshold, throwing the deadbolt. The medical bay was illuminated only by the faint, eerie green glow of the emergency exit signs, and the battery-powered monitors hooked up to Leo. Leo was sitting up on the edge of the bed, holding a matte black pistol, his face pale and tight with agony. His surgical site was bleeding again, soaking through his shirt. They breached the perimeter. Enzo panted, applying a tourniquet to the wounded guard's leg. At least 20 men. Tactical gear. They bypassed the external sensors. Pendleton must have given them federal frequency jammers. Heavy rhythmic pounding echoed against the steel door of the medical bay. "Breaching charge," Enzo yelled. "Get down." Abigail didn't drop to the floor. She looked around the room, her clinical mind processing the environment as a set of chemical and physical tools. They were trapped. The reinforced door would hold against bullets, but not against C4. "Enzo, get Leo into the radiology room," Abigail ordered. "What the walls are lined with lead." "Do it!" Abigail shouted, pointing to the heavy adjacent door that housed the compound's X-ray machine. Enzo didn't argue. He hauled Leo to his feet. Leo gritted his teeth, leaning heavily on his lieutenant, and stumbled into the reinforced room. Abigail ran to the corner of the medical bay. Secured to the wall were 3 massive pressurized oxygen tanks, the large industrial kind, used to supply the surgical vents. She grabbed a heavy steel wrench from the maintenance kit on the counter and began violently striking the brass valves of the tanks, snapping them off entirely. The hiss of highly pressurized, pure oxygen filled the room, deafening and violent. The air grew thick and cold. "Abigail!" Leo yelled from the doorway of the radiology room. She ran toward a rolling metal cart that held a defibrillator. She unplugged the machine from the wall, switching it to battery power. She cranked the joule setting to maximum. She grabbed the 2 heavy shock paddles, coated them in conductive gel, and threw them onto the metal surgical table positioned directly in front of the main door. The pounding on the main door stopped. A high-pitched electronic beep echoed from the other side. The breaching charge was set. Abigail grabbed a heavy roll of medical tape and wrapped it tightly around the shock buttons on the paddles, forcing them into a state of continuous discharge against the metal table. Sparks immediately began to arc, crackling viciously across the conductive surface. She turned and sprinted for the radiology room. Her lungs burned, her heavy legs pumping with terrifying power. She dove through the doorway, just as a muffled mechanical voice from the hallway yelled, "Execute!" Enzo slammed the heavy lead-lined door shut and spun the locking wheel. The explosion was a physical entity. It wasn't just loud, it was a concussive wave that punched the air out of Abigail's lungs, even through the thick walls. The breaching charge blew the main steel door inward, introducing a massive spark to a confined room filled with pure, unadulterated oxygen. The resulting thermobaric flashfire blew outward into the hallway. The shockwave rattled the entire foundation of the house, shattering the overhead lights and raining dust down on them. Inside the radiology room it was pitch black. Abigail was on the floor, her ears ringing so hard it caused a deep, sickening vertigo. She felt strong hands grabbing her arms, pulling her up. "Are you hit, Abigail? Answer me." Leo's voice was a low rumble against her ear. "No." She coughed, tasting dust and copper. "I'm okay." Enzo cracked the lead-lined door. The medical bay was a smoking ruin. The heavy steel table was warped, the drywall was charred black, and the hallway beyond was utterly silent. The tactical team had been standing directly in the path of a confined oxygen explosion. Nobody was getting up from that. Enzo stepped out, his weapon raised, sweeping the smoke-filled corridor. "Clear," he called back. "Boss, they're gone." Leo didn't let go of Abigail. He leaned against the wall, sliding down slightly, as his strength failed him, pulling her down with him until they were both sitting on the cold floor of the dark room. He rested his head back against the concrete, his chest heaving. He looked at her, his blue eyes catching the faint, flickering light of a distant fire in the hallway. "You turned my medical bay into a bomb." He breathed a mixture of awe and exhaustion in his tone. "Basic chemistry." Abigail said, her voice shaking violently as the adrenaline finally crashed. "Combustion needs fuel, oxygen, and a spark. I provided 2. Leo reached out his hand, cupping the side of her jaw. His thumb brushed away a streak of soot on her cheek. "You're a terrifying woman, Abigail Faith," he murmured. "You told me I take up space," she replied, leaning into his hand despite herself. The fear was gone, replaced by a strange, heavy realization. She had crossed a line she could never uncross. I figured I should make sure they felt it. 2 days later, the news hit the mainstream networks. Arthur Pendleton had been indicted on federal corruption charges after an anonymous package containing financial ledgers was delivered to the FBI director's home in D.C. Simultaneously, the Moretti family leadership was decimated by a series of highly organized, brutal raids across Chicago. Leo Castiglione had reclaimed his city. Abigail stood on the balcony of the Lake Geneva compound, wearing one of Leo's oversized cashmere sweaters against the chill. The threat was neutralized. The war was over. Enzo had informed her an hour ago that a car was ready to take her back to Chicago, to a new secure apartment paid for in